You grab bottled water because you think you're making the safest choice. No sugar, no calories, no junk. But what if the water itself contains something you'd rather not drink every single day? Today, we're looking at 7 popular water brands that have raised contamination concerns in independent testing, and 3 better options worth considering. And trust me, one of the biggest names on this list might surprise you. Let's start with a bottle millions of Americans have probably seen sitting inside a refrigerator at some point: Deer Park. It's one of those brands that feels almost invisible because it's everywhere. Grocery stores, gas stations, restaurants, office coolers, you name it. And the bottle tells you exactly what you expect to hear: natural spring water. Sounds pretty clean, right? But here's where things get interesting. Consumer Reports testing found detectable total PFAS in a Deer Park sample at about 1.21 parts per trillion. That's an incredibly tiny amount, and it's important to say right away, that number does not mean the bottle is suddenly dangerous. But if you're someone who drinks bottled water every single day, it's still worth knowing what's been detected. PFAS is the group of chemicals you've probably heard called forever chemicals. They don't break down easily, which is why scientists and regulators have been paying close attention to them. The strange part is that you can't taste them. You can't smell them. You can't look at a glass of water and say, yep, there's PFAS in here. It could look absolutely perfect. That's why laboratory testing matters. And Deer Park is a good example of why the words natural spring water shouldn't automatically make us assume something is the cleanest possible choice. See, spring water isn't necessarily purified water. Spring water comes from an underground source, and as that water travels through the environment, it can pick up naturally occurring minerals and potentially other substances. That's not automatically bad. In fact, some people specifically like spring water because of its mineral content. But the word natural doesn't mean contaminant-free. Nature doesn't come with a quality control department. That's why treatment and testing matter. And there's another important detail here. A test of one sample isn't a test of every bottle ever produced. Bottling plants can use different sources, treatment can change, manufacturing processes can change, and companies can improve their systems. So we're not saying every Deer Park bottle is contaminated. We're saying that if you're looking for the most conservative, everyday choice, there are other options where purification is a bigger part of the story. Now let's move from ordinary grocery store water to something that feels a little more upscale: Perrier. You know the bottle. Green glass, fancy bubbles, French branding, the kind of water that somehow makes a sandwich feel like lunch at a European cafe. But here's the thing. A premium image doesn't automatically mean premium purity. Consumer Reports testing found total PFAS at about 1.1 parts per trillion in the Perrier sample it tested. Again, we're talking about a very small concentration, not something that means you should panic or throw every bottle in your house into the trash. But it does give us something worth thinking about. Because when people hear premium bottled water, they often imagine that somebody found an untouched mountain spring and bottled it directly into a beautiful glass bottle. That's not really how modern bottled water works. There are sources, treatment systems, bottling facilities, transportation, storage, and quality control processes. The bottle may look fancy, but underneath all that branding, it's still a manufactured food product. And sparkling water makes the conversation even more interesting. Perrier isn't simply still water, it's carbonated water. Consumer Reports found detectable PFAS in multiple carbonated water products during its investigation. That doesn't mean carbonation itself is dangerous. It means the water's source and treatment process still matter, even when you're buying something that feels more like a sophisticated beverage than ordinary drinking water. So if Perrier is your occasional restaurant drink, there's no reason to freak out over one laboratory result. But if you're drinking sparkling water all day, every day, because you think it's automatically cleaner than regular water, that's where I'd start paying closer attention to the actual testing and filtration behind the brand. Next up is LaCroix. And honestly, this one might hurt a little. LaCroix basically became the poster child for people trying to ditch soda without giving up something fun to drink. You get the bubbles, the flavor, zero sugar, zero calories, and you don't feel like you're drinking plain old tap water. But Consumer Reports found total PFAS at about 1.16 parts per trillion in the LaCroix sample it tested. Once again, that's a detectable amount, not a declaration that LaCroix is dangerous, but it does show why 0 calories and clean water aren't necessarily the same thing. Think about it this way. If you replace soda with sparkling water, you're making a major nutritional upgrade because you're cutting out sugar and calories. That's great, but your next question can still be, okay, what's actually in the water? Those two questions aren't mutually exclusive. You can make a good choice and still find a better one. PFAS are particularly interesting because the concern isn't about taking one sip and suddenly having a problem. The conversation is about repeated exposure over time. These chemicals can persist in the environment, and scientists have studied potential associations between certain PFAS exposures and various health effects. That's why regulators have been moving towards stricter limits, and why reducing unnecessary exposure is generally a reasonable goal. But let's keep this grounded. A detectable laboratory result doesn't turn LaCroix into poison. That's not what the evidence says. The more reasonable takeaway is much simpler. If you're drinking multiple cans every day, and there are alternatives with stronger purification and cleaner testing, you have options. You don't have to panic. You can simply choose differently. At number 4, we've got another sparkling water favorite, Bubly. Same basic appeal. Bright cans, fun flavors, no sugar, and a much lighter alternative to soda. But Consumer Reports detected total PFAS at about 2.24 parts per trillion in the Bubly sample it tested. That's higher than the previous 3 brands we've covered. Again, tiny number, but detectable. And that's exactly why bottled water testing gets interesting. 2 cans can look almost identical from the outside, while laboratory testing tells a very different story. Most of us don't think about what's happening before that can reaches our hand. Water comes from somewhere, it gets treated, it travels through equipment, it gets packaged, it gets transported, and eventually you crack the can open and drink it. Every step is an opportunity for the final product to be different from the water that started the journey. That's why I don't want you to think of bottled water as simply water in a bottle. You're really buying a treatment and manufacturing process. Some companies rely heavily on purification. Others are selling natural spring or mineral water, where some of the original characteristics of the source remain. Neither approach is automatically good or bad, but if your goal is specifically to minimize contaminants, the purification process becomes a much bigger deal. And Bubly illustrates another important point. Don't confuse healthy compared with soda with the cleanest possible water. Bubly can be a perfectly reasonable alternative to sugary soft drinks, but if you're comparing it with highly purified still water, that's a different conversation entirely. Now we're getting into the more surprising results. At number 3 is Polar. Consumer Reports found total PFAS at approximately 6.41 parts per trillion in the Polar sample it tested. That's considerably higher than the brands we've already covered. And this is where you might look at the number and say, 6 parts per trillion? That's basically nothing. And technically, yes, we're talking about an incredibly small concentration. But the reason scientists care about tiny concentrations is that we're not talking about something your body needs in the first place. If you can reduce unnecessary exposure, why not? Here's a crazy way to understand the scale. 1 part per trillion is roughly comparable to 1 second out of about 32,000 years. That's tiny. So don't imagine that your bottle contains a bunch of chemicals floating around like soup. It doesn't. We're talking about microscopic concentrations that laboratories are sensitive enough to detect. But when you're drinking something once, that's one thing. When you're drinking the same thing every day for years, that's where researchers start asking different questions. Exposure is about dose, frequency, and time. It's the same reason you wouldn't judge someone's diet based on one cookie. One cookie isn't the story. The pattern is. And that's why Polar lands here. Not because we can say, this brand is dangerous. We can't. But if you drink sparkling water constantly, and your goal is to minimize PFAS exposure, the testing gives you a reason to consider other options. Now we come to one of the most famous sparkling waters in America, Topo Chico. This stuff has fans who are seriously loyal. They love the aggressive bubbles, the glass bottle, the taste, the whole experience. But Consumer Reports testing found approximately 9.76 parts per trillion of total PFAS sample it tested, the highest result among the 47 bottled water products included in that particular investigation. And this is where the story gets especially interesting, because Topo Chico didn't simply become a footnote in a laboratory report. The company responded. After the concerns were raised, Topo Chico said it upgraded its filtration system to reduce PFAS. Consumer Reports later reported that the upgraded filtration reduced PFAS levels by more than half. That's actually an important part of the story because it proves something we don't talk about enough. Water treatment can make a difference. So, should you throw away every bottle of Topo Chico you own? No, that would be ridiculous. The original test was a snapshot of specific products, and the company changed its filtration afterward. Newer products may not have the same levels, but if you're looking for the cleanest possible everyday water, the brand's history is something you should know about before making it your daily go-to. And there's a bigger lesson hiding right here, without turning this into a chemistry lecture. Testing matters. Without independent testing, we'd be judging water by the bottle, the advertising, and the reputation. With testing, we can actually ask what's inside. That's a much better way to make a decision. And now we get to number 1, Starkey spring water, sold by Whole Foods. This one is different because the main concern isn't PFAS, it's arsenic. Consumer Reports testing found arsenic levels around 9.49 to 9.56 parts per billion in Starkey samples. The federal limit for arsenic in bottled water is 10 parts per billion, so we're talking about levels extremely close to the legal limit. Now, arsenic isn't something that sounds friendly for a reason, but here's another place where the internet can get this completely wrong. Seeing arsenic detected doesn't mean the water is instantly poisonous. Arsenic can naturally occur in groundwater. The real concern is long-term exposure, particularly when levels are elevated. And Starkey has a history that makes this more concerning. The brand previously recalled products after regulators detected arsenic levels above the federal limit. Consumer Reports later continued finding relatively high arsenic levels in its testing. That history is why Starkey deserves more attention than a brand that had one random laboratory result years ago. Here's the weird thing. The water doesn't need to look suspicious. It can be crystal clear. It doesn't have to smell bad. It doesn't have to taste strange. Arsenic isn't going to walk up to you and introduce itself. That's why water safety depends so heavily on testing and treatment rather than your senses. And that's why, if I'm standing in a store looking at 2 bottles for everyday drinking, I'm not choosing the one with a repeated history of elevated arsenic results when there are plenty of alternatives. It's not about saying Whole Foods is selling poison, it's about making the easier choice when better options are available. So what should you actually buy? Here's the short answer. Look for purified water with a strong treatment process. You don't need a fancy label or a picture of a mountain. You want a company that can clearly explain how it treats the water. And 3 brands stand out as reasonable alternatives. At number 3 is Kirkland Signature Purified Water. This is probably the least glamorous bottle on the list, and that's actually part of why it makes sense. Costco says its bottled water goes through purification, filtration, and reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis uses a very fine membrane to remove a wide range of dissolved substances from water. In other words, the company isn't just relying on the fact that the water came from a natural source, it's actively treating it. And honestly, this is the kind of boring information I like seeing on a water bottle. What happened to the water before I drank it? Where did it come from? How was it treated? Was it filtered? That's much more useful than a beautiful picture of a waterfall. Kirkland also has one major advantage for everyday drinkers. It's inexpensive and widely available through Costco. If you're buying water for your family, that matters. You don't want a purification system that costs as much as your monthly phone bill just to stay hydrated. Number 2 is Life Water. PepsiCo says Life Water starts with public water sources and goes through a purification process that includes reverse osmosis, followed by additional treatment and the addition of electrolytes for taste. And I want to pause on one word here: purified. Some people hear purified water and think, wait, isn't that artificial? No, water isn't being manufactured from scratch, it's being treated. Think about it like washing an apple before you eat it. The apple is still an apple, you're just removing stuff you don't want on it. Purification is basically the grown-up version of that idea, just with much more sophisticated equipment. Life Water also makes a useful alternative if you prefer the taste of water with added minerals or electrolytes. Again, it isn't magic water. It isn't the only safe option. But the clearly described purification process makes it a reasonable choice for people who want something beyond untreated or minimally treated spring water. And my number 1 pick for this particular list is Aquafina. And I know what you're thinking. Aquafina? Seriously? Yup. Not because it's fancy, not because it has a beautiful mountain on the label, and definitely not because it tastes like it came from a secret glacier. It's because the company openly describes a fairly aggressive purification process. Aquafina says its water starts with public water sources and goes through multiple treatment stages, including reverse osmosis, carbon filtration, ozonation, and ultraviolet treatment. That's a pretty straightforward approach. Take the source water, treat it, filter it, disinfect it, and then bottle it. And this is why Aquafina gets the number 1 spot for me. When you're looking for an everyday bottled water, I care less about whether the water came from a beautiful mountain and more about whether the company can tell me exactly what it did to that water. Aquafina's purification process is clearly explained, and that's a big plus. It's also widely available. You don't have to hunt down a specialty grocery store or spend $5 on one bottle. You can find it at gas stations, supermarkets, restaurants, vending machines, and basically everywhere else Americans buy bottled water. For an everyday option, that combination of availability and extensive purification makes it a practical choice. There's also something else worth remembering. Bottled water isn't automatically better than tap water. Depending on where you live, your tap water may already be extremely well regulated and perfectly drinkable. And if you use a properly certified filter designed for the contaminants in your local water, you may have an even more practical solution. You can fill a reusable bottle, keep it cold in the fridge, and skip buying case after case of plastic bottles. The important part is knowing what you're actually dealing with. Check your local water quality report. Look at what contaminants are being monitored. If you use a filter, choose one that's certified for the contaminant you're trying to reduce. Don't just buy the most expensive filter on the internet because the box has a picture of a laboratory on it. And don't let this video make you afraid of water. That's not the point. Water remains one of the healthiest things you can drink. The point is simply that not every bottle is identical, and the label doesn't tell you the whole story. A spring isn't automatically cleaner. A fancy bottle isn't automatically safer. And a cheap, purified water bottle isn't automatically worse. So next time you grab bottled water, take a second look at what's actually behind the label. Subscribe to Unpoisoned America for more investigations into the everyday products Americans trust, because sometimes the biggest surprises are hiding in plain sight.